Early morning, Normandy, June 1944. A quiet dawn before a storm. German officers watch in disbelief as shells begin to land, one after another, not randomly, but with impossible accuracy. We freeze this moment, then pull back in time to show how the U.S. achieved this level of precision. Like Sikhuhu, share and subscribe for more real WWII stories that reveal the science, courage, and innovation behind victory. Before American guns shattered German defenses with near mathematical perfection, there was uncertainty, a dangerous imbalance in the world's understanding of modern war. In 1939, as Hitler's armies rolled across Europe, artillery was already the decisive arm of destruction. In Poland, France, and later in Russia, German guns dominated with terrifying efficiency. Their gunners had refined the art of indirect fire, plotting coordinates with trained instinct, guided by years of doctrine. When their salvos opened, they were fast, disciplined, and lethal. Across the Atlantic, the United States Army watched and learned, but from a distance. America's artillery doctrine was built from the lessons of the First World War, where brute force mattered more than precision. Guns were fired by estimation, corrections made by human judgment, not science. The Army's firing tables were outdated, its communication lines unreliable, and its gunners often lacked synchronized command. The idea of fire direction centers, where mathematical coordination replaced guesswork, was still in its infancy. When the U.S. entered the war in December 1941, its artillery was powerful but primitive compared to its European rivals. In the early campaigns, that gap showed. The first field deployments in North Africa exposed deep flaws, ranging from poor map accuracy to slow coordination between forward observers and batteries. Fire missions that should have lasted minutes often dragged on for hours. Targets were lost, shells wasted, and momentum sacrificed. The Germans, by contrast, treated their artillery as a perfectly tuned orchestra. Observation posts relayed target data in seconds. Each gun had pre-registered zones, and every crew knew the terrain as if they'd memorized it. American commanders saw the difference, and they knew that to win in Europe, this imbalance had to be erased. Inside the U.S. Army's training halls, particularly at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, a quiet revolution began. Mathematicians, engineers, and artillery officers started to ask a new question. What if accuracy could be calculated? They didn't need more firepower. They needed precision. Accuracy meant fewer rounds, faster victories, and fewer lives lost. But first, they had to overcome a problem of communication. In 1942, American artillery operated largely in isolation. Batteries worked independently, each with its own observers and maps. This fragmentation created chaos. Fire missions overlapped or left gaps. Infantry units advancing under this cover often walked into danger zones, unsure of where friendly shells might fall. To change that, the Army's Field Artillery School began designing new coordination systems that could centralize command and data. They envisioned a structure where each battery fed information into a central fire direction center, a nerve hub capable of converting raw coordinates into precise firing solutions in seconds. Here, the mathematics of war would find its purpose. It was also a psychological transformation. Artillerymen were no longer seen as brute soldiers manning heavy guns. They became mathematicians under pressure. Each firing solution depended on calculating wind speed, elevation, range, powder temperature, and even the Earth's curvature. For every shell to land where it was meant to, thousands of invisible numbers had to align. By mid-1943, America's artillerymen were evolving into something new. Soldiers who thought like scientists, men who measured death in degrees and seconds. And while the front lines shifted between Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy, behind those lines, the artillery schoolhouses burned with a new intensity. Training manuals grew thicker, calculations more complex, and the obsession with precision became doctrine. The German army, still confident in its traditional mastery, saw America's gunners as slower, less disciplined, too reliant on instruments. They believed experience would always beat arithmetic. But on distant proving grounds, American guns began to speak a different truth. Every round fired in practice was an equation solved. Every map drawn became a formula for destruction. And every correction made in training shortened the gap between theory and triumph. By late 1943, whispers spread among U.S. field units. Artillery no longer just supported the battle. It defined it. The next challenge was proving it under real fire, on terrain that would test every calculation, every formula, every ounce of American ingenuity. And that test would come soon, under the blinding sun and shifting sands of North Africa. The North African desert was merciless. Heat warped the horizon, sand swallowed tracks, and mirages turned distance into deception. When the U.S. Army landed there in late 1942, its troops faced not only Rommel's hardened Africa Corps, but a baptism by fire unlike anything they'd trained for. The first engagements at Kasserine Pass exposed every weakness the Americans possessed. Their artillery, though numerous, was disorganized. Batteries fired on incomplete coordinates. Forward observers struggled with poor radio links, and supply lines buckled under pressure. The desert offered no cover, and every error was magnified by open terrain. Shells often landed hundreds of meters off target. Some fell short, others overshot, and in the chaos, infantry units felt abandoned. German gunners, seasoned and confident, fired first, adjusted faster, and hit harder. After Kasserine, hard truth replaced optimism. American commanders admitted their artillery coordination was inadequate. Reports from the front painted a grim picture. Batteries operating in isolation, target spotting delayed by miscommunication, and corrections arriving too late to matter. Yet amid the criticism, a pattern began to form. The failures weren't from lack of courage or equipment, but from a lack of system. Back at Fort Sill, the nerve center of American artillery thought, instructors and engineers studied these reports line by line. They saw what the field couldn't yet see, that chaos could be measured, and mistakes could be solved with mathematics. The Army began refining its method of centralized fire control. Instead of each battery acting alone, they would now operate through a Fire Direction Center, FDC, a unified command brain linking observers, maps, and guns. This was the start of precision. Inside the FDC, officers gathered around plotting boards the size of tables, aligning map grids, trajectory lines, and target coordinates. Each correction from the field was recalculated instantly, producing firing data that could be transmitted across multiple batteries. It was teamwork transformed into computation. When American forces advanced again, the difference was visible. During the later stages of the North African campaign, U.S. artillery began to respond faster, seconds instead of minutes. Communication channels, though still crude, grew more disciplined. Observers used new portable radios, and for the first time, the phrase "time on target" entered the artillery lexicon. The concept that multiple batteries could fire from different positions, calculating shell flight times so that every round struck the target at the same instant. For the Germans, who had long prided themselves on precision timing, this was unsettling. Reports from Africa Corps officers noted, "The American guns are slower to begin, but once they start, they do not stop, and they do not miss." The desert became a classroom, and every bombardment was an exam in speed, accuracy, and adaptation. Artillery officers who once relied on instinct now relied on computation. In field tents lit by oil lamps, they performed trigonometry under stress, calculating corrections by slide rule, while shells whistled in the distance. It was mathematics meeting mortality. By the spring of 1943, the change was undeniable. American guns at El Getter and Maknessi demonstrated a new level of coordination. Barrages blanketed German positions with methodical accuracy. Fire was no longer random chaos, it was calculated rhythm. Infantry units advancing behind these barrages spoke of the ground trembling like a living machine. Rommel's veterans, once dismissive, began to take note. Intelligence intercepts revealed German astonishment at the rapid improvement of U.S. artillery. What had once been a weakness was evolving into America's defining advantage. When the North African campaign ended in Allied victory, the lesson was clear. America's guns could not only match the enemy, they could surpass them through intellect and innovation. The seeds of mathematical firepower had been planted in the sand. Now, those same officers, hardened by desert warfare, were preparing for a far greater challenge: Europe. They would take with them the methods born in North Africa, refine them with technology, and unleash them on the beaches of Normandy. But before that day arrived, a quiet revolution would continue. One fought not with guns, but with formulas, blueprints, and minds determined to make war a matter of precision. When American artillerymen returned from North Africa, they didn't bring back trophies. They brought back notebooks, filled with data, errors, and questions. Every missed shot had been studied. Every delay, every misfire, every correction was analyzed as if the war itself were a vast experiment. The crucible of the desert had taught them that courage alone didn't win battles. It was calculation that turned courage into victory. At Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the birthplace of U.S. artillery science, the transformation quickened. Classrooms once filled with field officers now resembled laboratories. Chalkboards lined the walls with ballistic equations, while instructors drilled new cadets in the geometry of death. Terms like deflection, drift, quadrant elevation, and meteorological correction became the new language of war. The process was relentless. Officers were taught to compute every variable: the weight of the shell, the density of the air, the rotation of the earth, and even how powder temperature altered range. Every firing solution became a math problem, one with no margin for error. From this obsession came a revolution. The Field Artillery Fire Direction Center, or FDC, became standard across the Army. What had been an experimental concept in North Africa was now institutionalized. For the first time, American artillery operated as a single organism. Every battery, every gun, every observer linked through precise mathematics and disciplined communication. The FDC was the beating heart of the system. Inside its canvas walls, teams of officers worked in near silence. A forward observer called in a target over radio: position, grid, distance. The data clerk translated it onto a plotting board. The computer, a title for the officer solving firing data long before machines bore the name, calculated range, azimuth, and time. Within seconds, firing orders rippled out to every gun in the sector, and when the guns spoke, they spoke together. This synchronization changed everything. Now, American artillery could strike multiple targets simultaneously, adjust fire in real time, and saturate enemy positions with clockwork precision. It was no longer a weapon of chance. It was a weapon of certainty. Behind this leap was not just innovation, but engineering brilliance. The slide rule, the protractor-based plotting board, and the gunner's quadrant, simple tools of metal and plastic, became as vital as the shells themselves. These instruments, mass-produced by American industry, allowed artillerymen to compute complex firing data without electricity or machinery. Mathematics was now portable. Training intensified. New recruits were taught to think faster than they could fear. Simulated fire missions were run by the hundreds. Officers competed for speed and accuracy, timing how quickly a target could be plotted and struck. By 1944, an American fire direction center could respond to a call for fire in under 3 minutes, a pace that would have been unthinkable only a year before. But this precision wasn't just about numbers. It was about trust. Infantrymen on the ground had to believe that when they called for fire, it would land exactly where it was needed. No more, no less. That trust, built through relentless practice, became one of the U.S. Army's deadliest weapons. The Germans, still relying heavily on localized artillery control, couldn't match this efficiency. Their batteries were skilled but rigid, bound to pre-registered targets. American artillery, by contrast, could improvise mathematically, adapting to the battlefield in real time. What began as a defensive doctrine was now an offensive art. Meanwhile, the integration of weather balloons, meteorological data, and aerial reconnaissance refined accuracy even further. The Americans began predicting shell drift through temperature layers of the atmosphere, something unheard of in earlier wars. It was as if nature itself was being measured and tamed for battle. As preparations for the Normandy invasion began, this system reached its peak. Thousands of artillerymen rehearsed coordinated fire plans, mapping every beach, every hedgerow, every likely German position. Massive grid overlays were drawn by hand, each square a calculated field of destruction. Every officer knew that when the invasion began, timing and mathematics would decide the outcome. From the windswept plains of Oklahoma to the hedgerows of France, a single principle had taken root. War could be calculated. Victory could be engineered. In the stillness before D-Day, American officers studied their tables one last time. Each coordinate was double-checked, every angle confirmed. The invasion would not be left to chance. It would be executed by design. Soon, across the English Channel, German officers would witness the result of this obsession. They would look skyward, listen to the thunder of American guns, and realize that the battlefield had changed forever. For when those shells began to fall, they would not fall randomly. They would fall with mathematical precision. War is often remembered in sweeping movements, armies advancing, cities falling, lines drawn on maps. But the story of American artillery was built not on broad strokes, but on angles, the unseen perspectives that together defined a new kind of warfare. The human angle. At the center of it all were the artillerymen, men who fought wars with mathematics instead of rifles. In muddy foxholes and makeshift command tents, they crouched over plotting boards, compasses, and maps, their faces dimly lit by lanterns. Each calculation carried the weight of lives depending on it. They spoke in coordinates, thought in ranges, and trusted only numbers. Artillery work demanded an unnatural calm. While infantry endured chaos at the front, gunners fought a quieter war, one of patience and precision. Every adjustment was deliberate. Every shell fired was a test of judgment. Soldiers joked that their weapon was the pencil, but they knew the truth. Accuracy was lethal. Some officers called it the thinking man's war, and for good reason. A single misplaced digit, a misread bearing, could turn success into catastrophe. Yet the best crews made it look effortless. They converted wind and distance into destruction. They knew that when their rounds landed exactly where called for, hundreds of lives were saved. The tactical angle. By 1944, American artillery doctrine had matured into a formidable tactical system. It was built not only to destroy, but to dominate the rhythm of battle. Centralized control through fire direction centers allowed dozens of batteries to converge their fire on a single target zone, sometimes within seconds of receiving coordinates. The Germans, accustomed to methodical engagements, found themselves trapped in storms of synchronized explosions. Whole formations were pinned down before they could even return fire. The U.S. Army's concept of time on target, having every shell from multiple batteries arrive simultaneously, was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had faced. It disoriented even veteran officers. German reports from Normandy described American barrages as mathematically impossible. Positions that should have taken hours to silence were obliterated in minutes. A single fire mission could involve dozens of guns, each miles apart, firing as one organism. The battlefield became a grid of destruction, mapped and managed with terrifying precision. What made this possible wasn't just the guns, but the network. The seamless flow of data between forward observers, FDCs, and batteries. The U.S. Army had learned to wage information warfare decades before the term existed. It was the ultimate coordination between human intuition and mathematical logic. The technological angle. Every instrument mattered. The American M12 150 mm gun motor carriage, the M7 Priest, and the classic Long Tom were all designed not just for power, but for flexibility. Their range and stability allowed for pinpoint accuracy once data reached the guns. Coupled with rapid calculation from FDCs, even mobile units could deliver precise strikes on moving targets. Technological support extended beyond the guns. Sound-ranging equipment, radar-assisted spotting, and aerial reconnaissance from light aircraft like the L-4 Grasshopper transformed how artillery perceived the battlefield. The gunners no longer guessed. They knew. Meteorological units calculated air temperature, wind drift, and humidity, feeding their data directly into firing tables. For the first time in history, weather itself was part of the firing equation. Nature was measured, quantified, and converted into accuracy. The leadership angle generals like Leslie J. McNair, Omar Bradley, and Dwight D. Eisenhower saw artillery as the great equalizer, a force multiplier that could compensate for terrain, weather, or manpower disadvantages. McNair, in particular, championed the belief that well-coordinated artillery could win battles before the infantry even advanced. He enforced standardization. Every gun crew trained the same way. Every fire direction center followed identical procedures. Every observer spoke the same language of coordinates. This discipline allowed an army spread across continents to operate as one synchronized machine. It wasn't just organization, it was philosophy. The enemy's perspective for the Germans, who had entered the war confident in their superior gunnery, the shock was profound. Reports captured after Normandy reveal astonishment at American accuracy. One German officer wrote, "They do not fire, they compute. Their guns answer faster than ours can think." Another report from the 352nd Infantry Division described U.S. barrages as predictable in timing, but not in location, impossible to evade. Even hardened veterans of the Eastern Front admitted that the Americans' scientific fire control created a new kind of battlefield, one where survival depended more on luck than skill. The moral angle, yet behind the triumph of numbers, lay the human cost. Precision made killing efficient. Every improvement in accuracy meant fewer wasted shells, but also more dead soldiers on the receiving end. Artillerymen rarely saw their victims. They saw only impact coordinates and radio confirmations. Many would later admit that this distance from the destruction haunted them. Still, they took pride in their purpose. For every town spared unnecessary damage, for every friendly unit saved from misfire, they knew the price of calculation was worth it. The American artilleryman stood at the crossroads of emotion and logic, a soldier of intellect in a war of instinct. His weapon was numbers, his enemy chaos. And as those numbers grew sharper, more disciplined, and more synchronized, they were about to unleash their most devastating performance yet, on the coast of France, where the precision of mathematics would meet the fury of history. June 6, 1944, around 5:30 hours. The horizon over Normandy was gray and trembling. The English Channel churned under a cold mist. Far beyond the beaches, aboard countless landing ships, American officers whispered final coordinates into radios. On the decks above them, rows of artillery pieces were locked, angled, and waiting. For weeks, those coordinates had been prepared. Not guessed, not hoped for, but calculated. Every gun position, every range, every anticipated German strongpoint had been plotted into firing tables months in advance. Engineers, mathematicians, and reconnaissance pilots had worked together to turn the French coastline into a living map of data. When the order came, fire! The world seemed to split in two. American naval and field artillery opened with staggering synchronization. The first shells whistled through the dawn, hundreds of trajectories converging on pre-selected zones. German positions that had stood silent for months erupted into fire and debris. It wasn't random destruction. It was geometry unleashed. From the bluffs above Omaha and Utah beaches, German officers watched the bombardment in disbelief. The first salvos struck communication bunkers, then machine gun nests, then the narrow roads leading inland. Every impact followed a pattern, north to south, east to west, as if an invisible hand was sweeping across the landscape with mathematical order. One German prisoner later recalled, "It was not bombardment, it was correction. Every minute, the pattern changed, closing around us." Behind that precision was a network unlike anything the world had seen. The U.S. Army's fire direction system fully realized. Forward observers positioned offshore, on destroyers, and even among the first waves of landing troops, relayed live corrections through portable radios. Each transmission was received by fire direction centers aboard ships and field batteries in England, where operators recalculated data in seconds and adjusted their guns. By the time infantry reached the beaches, artillery fire was already shifting inland, clearing pathways and silencing hidden emplacements. The result was organized chaos. The enemy destroyed before they could react. For the Germans, it was beyond comprehension. Their coastal batteries tried to respond but found no fixed targets. American artillery moved too fast, their fire too accurate. German radar operators noted shells landing with the precision of practice fire. The accuracy of the American guns on D-Day wasn't luck. It was the culmination of every equation learned in North Africa, every improvement tested in Italy, every calculation refined at Fort Sill. Artillery had become the silent architecture of invasion, unseen but omnipresent. As the beachhead expanded in the following days, the orchestration only grew. By mid-June, entire divisions could call for fire within minutes. The coordination between ground units, naval gunnery, and airborne observation created a seamless command web. In some sectors, more than 400 guns were controlled from a single fire direction center. Each strike plotted, timed, and confirmed. The real revolution, however, arrived not just in technique, but in technology. In July 1944, during Operation Cobra, the Americans introduced a secret weapon that would redefine artillery warfare: the proximity fuse. Developed in American laboratories and guarded as one of the war's most precious secrets, the proximity fuse transformed every shell into a self-calculating device. It could sense its distance from the target and detonate at the precise height for maximum effect. No longer did a round have to hit the ground. It exploded in the air, showering enemy troops with deadly fragments. When Cobra began on July 25, 1944, near St. Lo, the German 7th Army faced an artillery storm beyond imagination. Over 2,500 American guns opened fire in a single unified barrage. Observers described the sound as a continuous roar, like a train of thunder rolling endlessly over the horizon. But the effect was not just sound. It was science. Every trajectory was calculated, every detonation optimized. The proximity fuses ensured that not a single shell was wasted. German tank columns, previously resistant to conventional bombardment, were shredded from above. Command posts vanished in seconds. Survivors staggered through dust clouds, stunned and deafened, unable to comprehend how so many shells had found them so precisely. Captured reports from the German 352nd Infantry Division describe the moment. The American artillery lands not by chance. It lands by mathematics. It is not possible to escape. For U.S. commanders like General Omar Bradley, this precision marked a turning point. Artillery had become not just a supporting arm, but the main instrument of tactical dominance. When Operation Cobra's firestorm lifted, American armor surged forward through shattered lines. Within days, German defenses in Normandy began to collapse. Artillery had broken the stalemate. From that point onward, every major U.S. offensive, from the breakout through France to the crossing of the Rhine, carried the signature of coordinated precision fire. Batteries were no longer just responders. They were preemptive architects of battle. Firing tables, aerial spotting, radar-aided corrections, all combined to make the artillery corps America's invisible wall of dominance. Even seasoned Wehrmacht officers, veterans of years of combat, admitted in captured debriefings that they had never faced such accuracy. One colonel, taken prisoner near Falaise, confessed, "We were not defeated by numbers. We were defeated by calculation." In that realization lay the true revolution. The American soldier had fused courage with intellect, machinery with mathematics, will with precision. As the guns of Normandy fell silent, the path to liberation opened. France would soon be free, and the Germans would retreat, still haunted by the thunder that struck not by chance, but by design. Yet the story of this precision, this scientific mastery of destruction, was not over. The war was far from finished, and the artillery's legacy was just beginning to reshape how the world would fight. The thunder of Normandy faded into memory, but its echo rolled across Europe. The once invincible Wehrmacht, drilled in blitzkrieg and battlefield flexibility, now faced an enemy that struck not with speed alone, but with science, artillery fused with precision, data, and discipline. When the Allied front stabilized beyond the Seine, German field officers began to document their shock. Intelligence recovered from captured headquarters revealed handwritten notes. American gunnery defies weather. Range and time no longer matter. These reports, sent up the chain of command to Berlin, carried an unmistakable tone: disbelief. In one assessment written by Oberst Hans Joachim Kahler, formerly of the 352nd Division, he admitted, "Our defenses were mathematically destroyed, not overwhelmed, eliminated by numbers we could not counter." To the Americans, this was validation. The doctrines taught at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the home of U.S. artillery training, had proven themselves under the harshest conditions. Pre-war theories about indirect fire, forward observation, and ballistic computation had moved from textbooks to triumphs. The idea was simple, yet revolutionary. Every gun could be part of a greater equation. Back in Europe, U.S. commanders began to realize that artillery was no longer a supporting actor. It was the backbone of modern war. During the rapid advance from Normandy to the German border, artillery became the constant companion of maneuver. No American infantry division moved without its assigned battalion of guns, and no armored column advanced without mapped fire zones ready to be activated within minutes. Field manuals were rewritten in real time. Observers, mathematicians, and engineers worked side by side, creating a rhythm of warfare that depended on timing, not guessing. Even General George S. Patton, known for his love of speed and armor, remarked, "My men can't move unless the guns have cleared the road ahead. Artillery makes attack possible." In contrast, German field artillery, once formidable, began to falter. Supply shortages, fuel scarcity, and the constant Allied air dominance crippled their ability to respond. Their once feared 88mm guns were deadly in defense, but immobile, and predictable under the weight of constant American counter-battery fire. By late 1944, the tables had turned. American gunners had become hunters. The introduction of counter-battery radar, devices like the SCR-584, allowed them to detect the origin of enemy fire within seconds and return it with crushing accuracy. For the first time in military history, sound, radar, and mathematics worked together to eliminate an opponent before they could reload. When the Germans attempted their final major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, artillery decided the outcome. In the snow-covered Ardennes, visibility was near zero. Infantry fought blind, and armor crawled through fog. Yet American artillery never lost sight of its targets. Radar tracking and map triangulation allowed gunners to rain shells on advancing columns hidden beneath the trees. Entire German units were stopped cold before they ever saw the enemy. Prisoners taken during the battle described the experience as inhuman. "We moved at night, in silence," one soldier recalled, "but they always knew where we were. The fire came without warning. Perfect, accurate, endless." The lesson was clear. The Americans had mastered fire coordination, not just firepower. Every battery was a cog in a machine that thought, calculated, and adapted faster than human instinct. When Germany finally fell in May 1945, the U.S. Army's Artillery Corps stood as one of the most respected institutions of the war. In reports following VE Day, British analysts noted that American artillery had fired more rounds, achieved greater accuracy, and maintained higher mobility than any other force in history. The statistics told a story of their own. Over 600 million artillery rounds fired in the European theater. An average response time of under 5 minutes from request to fire. Accuracy within 50 yards at ranges exceeding 10 miles. Behind every number lay a principle: discipline, coordination, and trust in science. In post-war analysis, German generals repeatedly emphasized this difference. General Günther Blumentritt wrote in 1947, "The Americans fought like engineers. Every strike was preceded by study. We could not match that intelligence." By then, the WWII military had already begun to codify what it had learned. The Artillery Field Manual of 1945 formalized the principles of coordinated precision fire. Mathematics had become part of military doctrine. Not a secret weapon, but a standard. Even after the guns of Europe fell silent, their influence continued to shape the future. The techniques developed in Normandy and the Ardennes evolved into Cold War doctrine, influencing everything from Korea to Vietnam. The proximity fuse would later guide missile design, while the concept of synchronized fire networks paved the way for computer-assisted targeting systems. American dominance in artillery had started as an advantage of skill and science. By 1945, it had become a culture, a belief that wars were not won by strength alone, but by precision, discipline, and the mastery of calculation. In the ruins of Europe, the message was unmistakable. The battlefield belonged to those who could think in numbers, and from that moment on, the United States would never stop refining that equation. The war ended not with a shout, but with silence. Across Europe, the smoke cleared from ruined cities and broken fields. The thunder that once rolled from American guns faded into memory, leaving behind a strange stillness. The silence that follows precision. What began as a tool of destruction had become something more, a symbol of control, intellect, and the triumph of disciplined calculation over chaos. The American artillerymen who once crouched behind sandbags and steel shields had not just fought battles, they had measured them. Every shell, every trajectory, every timed burst had been an argument in favor of reason over rage. In the aftermath, historians and soldiers alike struggled to describe what had happened. Some called it the mathematical war. Others simply said, the Americans never missed. But the truth ran deeper. It wasn't just about accuracy. It was about transformation. For centuries, artillery had been the language of terror, unpredictable, deafening, blind. Yet in the hands of the Americans, it evolved into a language of mastery, calm, calculated, and deliberate. Each barrage was not chaos unleashed, but order enforced, a message written in smoke that the world would never forget. German officers, once confident in their tactical brilliance, had been forced to confront a new kind of enemy, one that fought with pencils and charts as fiercely as with rifles. They had faced not just soldiers, but thinkers, men who turned mathematics into might. From North Africa's deserts to the forests of the Ardennes, the rhythm of American firepower echoed one truth. Dominance is not achieved through strength alone, but through understanding, through the ability to measure, adapt, and strike with purpose. As the guns fell silent and the soldiers returned home, the legacy remained. Every future battle, in Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, and beyond, would carry within it the same philosophy born on the fields of Normandy and refined through fire. That precision is power, and in that precision lies something profoundly human. The desire to bring order to chaos, to turn noise into meaning, to ensure that even in destruction there is purpose. The Germans had called it mechanical. The world would come to call it genius. Because when American artillery thundered across Europe, it wasn't just the sound of victory. It was the sound of mathematics deciding the fate of empires.